The morning of November the 1st, 1944, began the way most mornings did at the forward staging area near Lyon, France. Cold, gray, smelling of aviation fuel and wet earth. A Douglas E-47 Skitran sat on the strip, with its twin Pratt & Whitney engines ticking in the pre-dawn chill, cooling down from a previous run. Ground crews worked in near silence, their breath rising in small clouds. Inside the fuselage, aluminum litter racks had been bolted 3 tiers high along each wall. 15 men lay strapped into those racks, 9 Americans, 6 German prisoners of war, all of them wounded, all of them dependent on the judgment and skill of a single Army flight nurse named First Lieutenant Alida Lutz. She was 28 years old. She had been born in Freeland, Michigan, the youngest of 10 children, the only one of them to finish high school. She had come up through the Saginaw General Hospital Nursing School, volunteered for the Army Nurse Corps in February 1942, and then done something only 2% of Army nurses ever did. She volunteered again, this time for flight duty, for the privilege of riding in an unmarked aircraft over contested airspace with no fighter escort and no Red Cross symbol on the fuselage, caring for men who might die before she reached the next airfield. By that November morning, Alida Lutz had flown 196 missions. She had logged 814 hours of flight time, more than any other flight nurse in the history of the United States Army Air Forces. She had evacuated more than 3,500 patients. She had once flown 4 sorties in a single day into the Anzio beachhead while it was still under German shell fire. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button, and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The C-47 lifted off into the overcast sky above Lyon and turned toward Italy. The patients were stable. The surgical technician was at his station. The weather reports had been acceptable, if not ideal. It was, by any measure, a routine mission for a woman to whom routine had come to mean something most people would consider extraordinary. She never arrived. The aircraft encountered a violent storm over the Massif Central, the ancient volcanic plateau of south-central France. The pilot lost control somewhere over the shoulder of Mont Pilot. The plane struck the mountainside at altitude. There were no survivors. The Army awarded Alida Lutz the Distinguished Flying Cross posthumously. She became the first American woman to receive that decoration in wartime. But what is perhaps most striking about her story, and about the stories of every woman who flew those evacuation missions, is not the decoration that came at the end, nor even the extraordinary record of service that preceded it. It is the simple, almost incomprehensible fact of what these women were doing in the first place, and the lengths to which the institution they served had gone only a few years before to make absolutely certain they could never do it. To understand why that matters, you have to go back to the beginning, back to before there was a program, before there were wings, before anyone in a uniform with enough stars on his collar was willing to admit that the United States Army needed women flying into combat zones at all. The year is 1942. America has been at war for less than a year. The shock of Pearl Harbor is still fresh. The mobilization still lurching. The Army Nurse Corps has existed since 1901, but its nurses are overwhelmingly land-based. They work in fixed hospitals, evacuation hospitals, field hospitals. They follow the armies. They do not, as a rule, fly with them. The idea of using aircraft for medical evacuation is not new in 1942, but is nearly untested at scale. During the First World War, a handful of experimental flights had moved wounded soldiers by air, mostly in converted observation planes with no medical equipment and no trained personnel. The concept had languished in the interwar years, debated in journals, sketched in planning documents, but never built into doctrine. When the Second World War began, the Army Air Forces possessed no trained flight nurses, no dedicated evacuation squadrons, and no coherent doctrine for moving casualties by air. What they possessed instead was a powerful institutional reluctance. The source of that reluctance was not complicated. It was the same reluctance that shaped nearly every decision about women in the wartime military. The bedrock assumption that combat zones were inherently male spaces, that placing women in proximity to danger was not merely impractical, but somehow morally disordered, a violation of the natural order that the war itself was supposed to be defending. The Army did not frame it in those terms, of course. The language was always procedural. Women were not equipped for the physical demands. Women created command complications. Women introduced complications of morale. Women in a combat zone would require protection that the military could not afford to extend. These arguments were not entirely cynical, some of the men making them genuinely believed what they were saying. But the arguments conveniently converged on a conclusion that served institutional interests independent of their merits. Women should stay back. The problem was that the war did not cooperate with this preference. By the summer of 1942, American and Allied forces were fighting in North Africa, in the Pacific, across vast stretches of territory where the physical geography made ground-based evacuation a slow, expensive, and often lethal undertaking. Men were dying not from their wounds alone, but from the time it took to move them from a forward aid station to a surgical facility. The distances involved were not measured in miles, but in days. A soldier wounded in the Tunisian desert might spend 48 hours or more in transit before reaching a surgeon. By that point, what had been a survivable injury was frequently not. Air evacuation offered a solution that was mathematically compelling. AC-47 that could fly 400 miles in 2 hours could accomplish what a truck convoy would need 2 days to achieve. The wounded soldier who spent 2 hours at altitude under the care of a trained medical professional had a dramatically better chance of survival than the one who spent 48 hours on a rutted road in the back of an ambulance. The Army understood this. The numbers were not subtle. What the Army did not have in the fall of 1942 was the personnel to execute it. The training program that would produce America's flight nurses was assembled at Bowman Field near Louisville, Kentucky, in an atmosphere of improvisation bordering on desperation. The first 2 squadrons, the 801st and the 802nd Medical Air Evacuation Transport Squadrons, were being organized and trained simultaneously, and the pressure to deploy them was so intense that the Army shipped the first nurses overseas before the training program was even finished. They landed in North Africa on Christmas Day, 1942, still technically in training, assigned to fly missions they had not yet been formally certified to fly. The curriculum, when it finally cohered, was unlike anything in the history of American nursing. Students at Bowman Field learned crash procedures, how to brace for impact in a fuselage without harnesses designed for the purpose, how to assess and triage patients in the immediate aftermath of a forced landing. They studied survival techniques for ocean, jungle, desert, and Arctic environments, because the aircraft they would fly might go down anywhere in the world. They learned the physiology of high altitude and its effects on different categories of patients, how a broken jaw wired shut could become a death sentence if the patient vomited at altitude, how changes in atmospheric pressure could expand gas trapped in a surgical wound, how cold at altitude could induce shock in a man who had already lost blood. They learned to start intravenous lines and administer oxygen, procedures that at the time were considered the exclusive province of physicians. They also learned to outrank the men who flew with them. This was perhaps the most radical aspect of the flight nurse program, and the most quietly revolutionary. Each evacuation team consisted of 1 flight nurse and 1 surgical technician, an enlisted man. The flight nurse, a commissioned officer, a second lieutenant, held authority over medical care of every patient on the aircraft, not the pilot, not the co-pilot. The nurse, in a culture that regarded female authority over men as deeply aberrant, the Army Air Forces had constructed a system in which it was mandatory. The reason was not idealism. It was practical. Someone had to be in charge of the patients, and the person with the medical training was the nurse. The Army reached this conclusion not through reflection on gender equality, but through the logic of patient survival, and having reached it, codified in regulation. The flight nurse was responsible for the safety and comfort of her patients, period. This did not eliminate resistance. It institutionalized attention that would follow the flight nurses through their entire wartime service and long beyond it. The first women to fly the evacuation missions in North Africa did so under conditions that the program's advocates had promised would not occur. They were flying over contested airspace in aircraft that were not marked with the Red Cross. The reason for this was strategic rather than malicious, but the effect was the same. The C-47s that flew evacuation missions also carried supplies and cargo on the outbound leg, fuel ammunition, medical equipment for the forward hospitals. Under the laws of war, an aircraft engaged in dual use could not claim protections of the Red Cross. To mark such a plane with that symbol would have been a violation of the Geneva Convention, not a compliance with it. The Army therefore made its evacuation aircraft into legitimate military targets and trusted that the enemy would not identify them as medical transports. In practice, the enemy sometimes did and sometimes did not. The ambiguity was its own kind of danger. It was partly for this reason that the Army established a rule that flight duty was entirely voluntary. No nurse could be assigned to flight evacuation against their will. The danger was too real, the conditions too uncertain, and the Army could not in conscience mandate participation in a program where the aircraft carrying its nurses were legal targets for enemy fire. The women who flew did so because they chose to fly. This is worth pausing over. The institutional logic that had spent years constructing arguments for keeping women out of combat zones now found itself constructing an entirely different argument. The zones were too dangerous for mandatory assignment, so we will only send the women who ask. The women, in enormous numbers, asked. By the time the program reached full operational scale in 1943, 30 medical air evacuation transport squadrons were being organized, trained, and deployed across every theater of the war. At the height of operations, 500 flight nurses were serving simultaneously with the Army Air Forces. They flew in the Mediterranean, in the Pacific, over the English Channel, across the Himalayas on the China-Burma-India route. They flew from forward strips still under shell fire and from airfields that had been in enemy hands the week before. They flew in aircraft with no heat, no pressurization, no navigational aids beyond what the pilot could see and the radio could confirm. The statistics of what they accomplished are almost abstract in their scale. Between January of 1943 and May of 1945, American military aircraft evacuated 1,172,000 patients. Of those, only 46 died in flight. 46 in over 1 million patient transports. That number is not an accident. It is a measure of what those nurses and their surgical technicians were capable of, performing emergency medicine in the back of a cargo aircraft at altitude in turbulence, with equipment that had been improvised from whatever was available and whatever could be strapped down. But the program was not only a statistical achievement. It was also a series of individual human stories, and some of those stories reveal something about the nature of institutional courage. The courage it takes to press an unwilling system towards something it does not want to come, that is at least as important as anything that happened in the air. Consider what happened on November the 8th, 1943, a date that most people who know anything about the flight nurses program consider one of its defining moments, though not for a reason anyone would have wished. A Douglas C-53 transport took off from Catania, Sicily, bound for Bari on the eastern coast of Italy. The flight should have taken 90 minutes. On board were 13 flight nurses and 13 surgical technicians of the 807th Medical Air Evacuation Transport Squadron, along with 4 crewmen. They were a new unit, recently deployed, still learning the rhythms of their assignment. The weather, which had seemed manageable at departure, turned violent over the Adriatic. The plane encountered waterspouts, rare, disorienting columns of spinning water rising from the sea surface, and the navigator lost his position. The compass was unreliable. Radio contact faded. When the pilot finally put the aircraft down, they were not in Italy. They were not anywhere near Italy. They had crossed the Adriatic entirely and crash-landed in the mountains of Albania, a country simultaneously occupied by Germany and tore apart by a civil war between communist and nationalist partisans, with both groups competing for control of territory that neither fully held. All 30 people aboard survived the crash. They then spent the next 2 months attempting to reach Allied lines on foot. What followed was one of the most extraordinary survival stories of the Second World War, though it was classified for decades and remains less well known than it deserves. The group, nurses, medics, and crewmen, moved through the Albanian highlands in winter, guided by Albanian partisans whose loyalties were complex and whose resources were minimal. They crossed mountain passes in snowstorms. They sheltered in stone farmhouses and village mosques. They were shot at by German patrols. They contracted dysentery and malaria. They wore their shoes until the soles separated from the uppers, and then they kept walking. The image that most powerfully captures what they endured is a photograph taken on January the 9th, 1944. The day 23 of the 30 survivors reached Allied lines at the Albanian coast and were finally evacuated. In the photograph, several of the nurses are shown holding up their shoes, not to demonstrate damage, but because the shoes themselves have essentially ceased to exist as functional objects. The leather is cracked and split, the soles detached, the uppers held together by what appear to be improvised ties. The nurses are smiling. 23 were rescued on January the 9th. The remaining 3 were not evacuated until March the 21st. Every one of the 30 people who had boarded that aircraft survived and returned to Allied control. None were captured. None were lost. This, in a country under German occupation, traversed in winter, by a group that included 13 women whom the institutional logic of the Army Air Forces had, just a year earlier, been actively discussing whether to send overseas at all. The 3 remaining survivors were extracted 2 months later, in March of 1944. The story was classified. The nurses were ordered not to speak about their experiences. A standard wartime regulation meant protect personnel still in the field, but one that had the effect of erasing this particular chapter from public view for decades. When they came home, they did not give interviews. They did not appear at rallies. They went back to their units, or they went home, and the story of what they had done simply did not exist in the public record. This is a pattern that runs through the history of the flight nurses like a structural fault line. The institutional machinery that deployed them was also, in important respects, the machinery that obscured what they had done. The very classification systems and regulations designed to protect operational security also had the effect of keeping these women's contributions from being counted in the ledger where the war's heroism was tallied. The most complete illustration of this pattern involves a woman named Reba Zatello-Whittle. She was born in 1919 in Rock Springs, Texas, in the Edwards County Hill Country, a landscape of cedar and limestone, cattle ranches, and dry creek beds, as far from a military aircraft as it was possible to be in the continental United States. She attended North Texas State College and then trained at the Medical and Surgical Memorial Hospital School of Nursing in San Antonio. She joined the Army Nurse Corps, volunteered for flight duty, and was assigned to the 813th Medical Air Evacuation Squadron based in England. If you find the story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. By the fall of 1944, Reba Whittle had logged more than 500 hours of flight time across 40 missions. She had flown over occupied Europe in unmarked aircraft without fighter escort, caring for patients in the unheated, unpressurized fuselage of AC-47 at altitudes where the temperature could fall far enough below zero to freeze the bottles of plasma hanging beside her patients' litter racks. On the morning of September the 27th, 1944, she strapped into her seat in AC-47 named Mary, tail number 43, 48, 395, and prepared for what should have been a routine outbound flight from Royal Air Force Base Wharton in Lancashire. The aircraft was carrying medical supplies to a field hospital in northeastern France. After delivery, Mary was to be loaded with wounded American soldiers and flown back to England. It was a standard double-duty run that defined the practical reality of air evacuation. Supplies out, casualties back. In her diary, Whittle wrote that she had been sleeping in the back of the aircraft when she was, in her words, suddenly awakened by terrific sounds of guns and cracklings of the plane as if it had gone into bits. She could hear the left engine on fire. No one knows with certainty why the C-47 Mary was where it was when it was hit. Aachen, where the aircraft went down, is roughly 70 kilometers from where it should have been, a significant navigational error, the cause of which was never established. What is documented is that German anti-aircraft fire struck the aircraft while it was over territory that was, at that moment, still very much in German hands. The 2 pilots were critically injured. Mary's crew crawled out of the burning wreckage into German hands. Reba Whittle became the only American military woman taken prisoner by Germany in the European theater of the Second World War. She was 25 years old. She had a concussion from the crash, lacerations to her face and back, and injuries that would trouble her for the rest of her life. She was marched, along with her surviving crewmates, to a German military hospital for examination. It was there, as she later recorded in her diary, that a German doctor leaned across the examination table, studied her, and finally shook his head slowly. He said in her account, simply, "Too bad having a woman. You are the first." The Germans did not know what to do with her. This is not a metaphor. Germany was a signatory to the Geneva Conventions governing the treatment of prisoners of war, and those conventions had been drafted with the assumption that prisoners would be men. There were established procedures for male prisoners, camps, protocols, chain of command. There was no established procedure for an American woman in a flight nurse's uniform with captain's insignia and an Army Nurse Corps identification card. For nearly 5 months, the German military bureaucracy at various levels attempted to resolve this ambiguity. Reba Whittle sat in the resolution of that ambiguity, in a hospital near a prisoner of war camp, doing what she had been trained to do, taking care of the wounded. The Germans, whatever their uncertainty about her status, had no uncertainty about her value. The hospital held American prisoners, as well as German patients. Whittle's medical skills were needed. She worked. She tended wounds. She administered medication. She learned, over those months, the faces and names of the American prisoners who passed through that facility. She wrote in her diary about a soldier named Davis from Dallas, who she would never forget. She was returned to Allied control in February of 1945 as part of a prisoner exchange negotiated through the International Red Cross. She received the Air Medal and the Purple Heart. She was ordered by the Army not to speak about her experiences. She never did, not even to her own family. She returned to service, developed health problems that she attributed to the crash, a severe brain concussion, injuries to her back, and sought disability benefits from the Army. The Army declined to recognize her injuries as combat-related. Their position was that her injuries had not been incurred under battle conditions. She had been shot down over active enemy territory on a military mission in a combat aircraft, captured by enemy forces, and held for nearly 5 months. The Army's Medical Review Board nonetheless maintained that the relevant standards for a combat injury had not been met, because she was a nurse and nurses were not, by definition, in combat. This was not an isolated bureaucratic error. It was a logical terminus of the same institutional reasoning that had, for years, simultaneously deployed these women into combat conditions and maintained, for administrative purposes, that those conditions did not apply to them. The flight nurses flew in unmarked aircraft over enemy territory without Red Cross protection. They were legitimate military targets. Several were killed by enemy action. They were, by any reasonable definition, in combat. The Army's administrative categories simply did not extend to them. Reba Whittle was not recognized as a prisoner of war until 1992. By that point, she had been dead for 11 years. Her husband, Stanley Tobiasen, said that she would have been very delighted to understand what the flight nurses were actually doing in the aircraft, the physical and medical reality of those missions. It is necessary to spend a moment with the machinery of the work itself, because the institutional story and the human story are only fully comprehensible against the background of what these women were actually accomplishing. A Douglas C-47 Skitran had a fuselage roughly 60 feet in length, unheated, unpressurized, corrugated aluminum along the interior walls. When configured for medical evacuation, aluminum litter racks were clamped along each side of the fuselage, 3 tiers high. A standard load was between 18 and 24 patients, depending on the mix of litter cases, and ambulatory wounded, the walking wounded, who could sit on canvas bench seats along the center of the aircraft. The flight nurse and her surgical technician were responsible for every one of these patients from takeoff to landing. The medical equipment available to them was, by the standards of a field hospital, extremely limited. They carried morphine, plasma, oxygen, bandaging materials, splints. They had been trained to start intravenous lines, a skill then reserved for physicians in civilian practice, because there was nobody else who could do it. They had been trained to manage hemorrhage, shock, airway obstruction, and the effect of altitude on surgical wounds. They had not been trained to do any of this in a cargo aircraft in turbulence at 15,000 feet with no physician, no anesthesiologist, and no operating room. They did it anyway because the mission required it. The altitude was its own clinical problem. At altitude, oxygen partial pressure decreases. A patient who was marginal at sea level could go into respiratory failure at 8,000 feet. A patient with a jaw wired shut, the standard fixation for a broken jaw before modern surgical techniques, could die if he vomited and could not clear his airway. The flight nurse monitored each patient continuously, adjusting oxygen flow, repositioning patients to manage their breathing, watching for signs of shock at altitude could precipitate in a man who had already lost blood. A bout of air sickness in a man with a wired jaw was not merely uncomfortable, it was potentially fatal. The flight nurse knew this and worked around it. In one documented case from September of 1944, Flight Nurse First Lieutenant Mary Louise Hawkins was evacuating 24 patients from Palau to Guadalcanal when her C-47 ran low on fuel and was forced to make an emergency landing on Bologna Island. During the landing, a propeller blade sheared through the fuselage and severed the trachea of one of her patients. With no surgical equipment, no physician, and no hospital, Hawkins performed an emergency tracheotomy using improvised instruments, including an inflation tube taken from a Mae Westlife vest. The patient survived. All 24 of her patients survived. Mary Louise Hawkins received the Distinguished Flying Cross. These were not exceptional women in the sense of being extraordinarily unusual. They were exceptional in the sense of being extraordinarily capable people who had been placed in extraordinary circumstances by a machinery of war that needed what they could provide, even as parts of that same machinery continued to argue that what they were providing was something women could not or should not do. The contradiction was never fully resolved. It simply became less and less sustainable as the war continued, and the evidence of what these women were capable of accumulated mission by mission, patient by patient, diary entry by diary entry, until the record itself was undeniable, even if the acknowledgement was slow to follow. By the time 1944 turned into 1945, the Army had evacuated more than 1 million patients by air. The survival rate of patients in transit was extraordinary by the standards of any previous war. A mortality rate in flight of roughly 4 patients per 100,000. The women who had been kept out and then admitted reluctantly, and then deployed in unmarked aircraft without protection, and then told they had not technically been in combat, those women had achieved something that no military medical system in history had achieved before. They had made the sky into a place where wounded men could be saved. The full weight of what that meant would take decades to register in the official record. The medals came slowly, and sometimes posthumously, and sometimes not at all. The disability benefits were contested and often denied. The recognition of prisoner of war status came 50 years late. But the patients, the 3,500 men that Alida Lutz evacuated, the patients that Rebo Whittle tended in a German hospital, the 24 men that Mary Louise Hawkins brought home from Bologna Island, those patients arrived. They arrived because women who had been told they did not belong in that sky got into the aircraft anyway and flew. Alida Lutz took off from Lyon on November the 1st, 1944, carrying 15 wounded men, 9 Americans, 6 Germans, toward a hospital in Italy. The storm that took her aircraft was not an enemy action. It was not a policy failure. It was simply the weather, which does not observe the distinctions that institutions make between those who are allowed to be in a given place and those who are not. She was 814 hours into a service that the Army had spent years trying to prevent women from performing. I'll write a continuation of this documentary-style narrative about the World War II flight nurses program. The war ended in stages. Germany surrendered in May of 1945. Japan followed in August. The machinery of mobilization, which had taken years to build and had consumed the lives and energies of 16 million Americans in uniform, began the slower and less dramatic work of dismantling itself. Troops came home. Factories converted. The great logistical apparatus of modern industrial warfare was methodically disassembled, and with it, quietly and without ceremony, the medical air evacuation transport squadrons were stood down. The flight nurses came home too. What awaited them was not, in most cases, what they had left. America in the autumn of 1945 was a country engaged in a particular kind of collective reimagining, a reimagining of what the war had meant, who had fought it, and what the peace that followed should look like. The story the country told itself was, broadly, a story about men, the soldier, the sailor, the airman, The returning veteran who had gone overseas was a boy and come back something harder and more serious, who deserved a house and a job and a future commensurate with what he had given. The GI Bill was written for him. The post-war economy was organized around him. The cultural mythology that would harden over the following decades, the mythology of the greatest generation, of sacrifice and duty and masculine valor, was constructed largely in his image. The women who had served were not excluded from this mythology so much as they were simply not included in it. Their contributions were not denied, precisely. They were something subtler and more durable than denied. They were absorbed into a supporting narrative. The nurses who cared, the women who waited, the home front that held while the men fought, in a way that made their actual experience essentially invisible. The flight nurse who performed an emergency tracheotomy with a Mae West inflation tube at 8,000 feet over the Pacific became, in the cultural shorthand of the post-war years, simply a nurse. The woman who had spent 2 months walking through German-occupied Albania in shoes held together with improvised ties became simply a veteran, a category that the bureaucratic and social machinery of post-war America had not been particularly designed to accommodate. This invisibility had material consequences. The Veterans Administration, which administered the benefits owed to returning service members, was in 1945 an institution designed almost entirely around the needs of male veterans. The disability claims process, the vocational rehabilitation programs, the hospital system, all of it had been built at a scale and with an orientation that reflected the composition of the military as the institution imagined it, which was to say, as overwhelmingly male. Women veterans found themselves navigating a system that was not hostile to them in any deliberate sense, but that had simply not been designed with them in mind, which produced many of the same practical outcomes as hostility. For the flight nurses specifically, the problem was compounded by the same definitional ambiguity that had followed them throughout their service. They had flown in combat conditions. They had been legitimate military targets. Some had been wounded. One had been captured and held as a prisoner of war. Several had been killed, and yet the institutional categories that determined veterans' benefits continued to reflect the position that these women had not, in the relevant administrative sense, been in combat. The conditions under which they had served were acknowledged. The implications of those conditions were not. The women themselves rarely fought this in public. Some of them never spoke about their service at all, not because they were ashamed, but because the culture did not have a ready place to receive what they would have said. Reba Whittle kept her silence for decades. The nurses who walked out of Albania returned to their units and then to their lives and found that the story they carried had no obvious place to be set down. There were no memoirs waiting to be written, no publishers eager for the accounts of women who had fought. There were, in a meaningful sense, no readers yet prepared to understand what they had done or why it mattered. This is a part of the history that is most difficult to hold alongside the operational record, without a sense of profound imbalance. Consider the arithmetic of it. Between January of 1943 and the end of the war, 500 flight nurses served simultaneously with the Army Air Forces at the peak of operations. Across all theaters, the evacuation program, they staffed moved more than 1 million patients. 17 flight nurses were killed in the line of duty, some in crashes, some lost with their aircraft over open water, one in the storm over the Massif Central. Others were wounded. One was taken prisoner. The mortality rate of the patients in their care was 4 per 100,000. No previous military medical system in history had approached that number. Set against that record, the institutional response, the contested disability claims, the delayed prisoner of war recognitions, the administrative insistence that combat conditions had not technically been met, acquires a quality that is difficult to characterize charitably. It is not that the Army was indifferent to what these women had done. It is that the categories to which the Army understood and rewarded service had been built without them, and rebuilding those categories required an institutional willingness to acknowledge something the institution had resisted from the beginning, that these women had been in the war, fully and dangerously, and that the war had been in them. That acknowledgement came slowly. It came through persistence of individual veterans and their families, through historians who found the classified records and began to read them, through journalists who tracked down the women who were still living and finally asked them what they had seen. It came through Congress, which in 1991 and 1992 began the process of formally recognizing the POW status of women like Reba Whittle, recognition that arrived in her case 11 years after her death, and in the cases of others, only after they had spent decades filing the same claims against the same bureaucratic refusals. What it did not come through, in any systematic way, was the cultural apparatus that had built the mythology of the greatest generation in the first place. The films and the novels and the monuments that shape how Americans understood the Second World War were slow to include these women, and when they did, it was usually at the margins, a nurse in the background of the scene set in a field hospital, present but not centered, caring but not acting, defined by her relationship to the wounded men she tended rather than by the decisions she made and the risks she absorbed. The fullest tribute to what they had actually done remained, perhaps the number itself. For patients per 100,000, 1,172,000 transported, 46 deaths in flight. Those numbers do not belong to the mythology. They belong to the record. And the record does not require interpretation or advocacy or cultural accommodation. It simply sits there in the archives, in the operational reports, in the logbooks where hours were counted and sorties were tallied, and names were entered in the columns reserved for those who had done the work. 814 hours, 196 missions, 3,500 patients evacuated. First Lieutenant Alita Lutz, United States Army Nurse Corps, flight nurse. The sky above the Massif Central on the morning of November 1st does not know what the Army thought women were capable of. It simply was what it was: cold, turbulent, indifferent to the distinctions that institutions make. She flew into it anyway, as she had flown into 195 skies before it, because the men strapped into the litter racks behind her needed to arrive somewhere, and she was the one who was going to get them there. That is the whole of it, and it is enough. Those numbers do not belong to the detailed historical breakdowns. They belong to the record. Check out the other videos on your screen now. Not require interpretation. And don't forget to subscribe. Or advocacy or cultural accommodation. It simply sits there in the archives, in the operational reports, in the logbooks where hours were counted and sorties were tallied, and names were entered in the columns reserved for those who had done the work. 814 hours, 196 missions, 3,500 patients evacuated. First Lieutenant Alita Lutz, United States Army Nurse Corps, flight nurse. But the record, if you stay with it long enough, is not only numbers. It is also the texture of the thing itself, the granular, physical, human reality of what those hours and missions and patients actually consisted of, accumulated across years of service that no ledger entry can fully contain. It is the smell of aviation fuel and antiseptic at 4 a.m. on a forward airstrip that did not exist on any map printed 6 months earlier. It is the sound of a Pratt & Whitney engine turning over in the pre-dawn dark, and a particular quality of silence that follows it when the engine catches, and the noise becomes something steady and purposeful rather than something tentative. It is the way of a plasma bottle held at altitude against turbulence, and the calculation, performed not with instruments but with trained hands and trained eyes, of how much a man has left to give before the arithmetic stops working in his favor. It is a decision made in a fraction of a second over the Pacific or the Mediterranean or the English Channel, to do the thing that needed doing with whatever was at hand, because the alternative was to watch someone die who did not have to. These are not abstractions. They happen to specific women in specific aircraft on specific days, and the women who survived them carried the weight of those days for the rest of their lives, largely without the structural support that the culture extends to those whose service it has chosen to center. The flight nurse who came home in the autumn of 1945 came home to a country that was, in its way, grateful, but grateful in the manner of someone who has received a service they did not fully understand and are not entirely certain they wish to examine too closely. The gratitude was real. The examination did not follow. What followed, for many of them, was simply life. They married or they did not. They returned to nursing. In civilian hospitals, with procedures they had mastered under fire, were sometimes regarded with skepticism by physicians who had not watched them performed in a cargo aircraft at 15,000 feet. They raised children who did not know, for decades, what their mothers had done, because their mothers had been ordered not to say, and then habit had settled over the silence, and then the silence had simply become the shape of the thing. Some of them lived long enough to see the acknowledgement begin, the memorials dedicated, the histories written. The congressional recognitions passed, slow and insufficient and late, but passed. Some of them sat in hearing rooms and spoke, finally, into a record that was prepared at last to receive what they said. A handful were still living when researchers and documentarians began to ask the questions that should have been asked decades earlier, and those women answered with precision and a composure that suggested they had always known the account would eventually need to be given and had kept the details carefully, just in case. Others did not live to see it. Reba Whittle died in 1981, her prisoner of war status still unrecognized, her disability claim still unresolved, the story she'd been ordered not to tell still largely untold. Alida Lutz has no grave, because the wreckage of her aircraft was not fully recovered from the slope of Mont Pilot. There's a monument in Freeland, Michigan, in the town where she was born, the youngest of 10 children, the only one to finish high school, the one who decided that flying into a war zone to bring wounded men home was something she was willing to do 196 times. The sky above the Massif Central on the morning of November, the 1st, does not know what the Army thought women were capable of. It simply was what it was, cold, turbulent, indifferent to the distinctions that institutions make. She flew into it anyway, as she had flown into 195 skies before it, because the men strapped into the litter racks behind her needed to arrive somewhere, and she was the one who was going to get them there. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.